All right, very good. Well, hello to everybody. My name is Brian Brockway. We're in the Cloud First presentation where we're going to be going through some of the best practices and what we've been doing with a variety of our customers in and around a number of cloud-based use cases. I think as everybody can probably attest to, cloud's a very popular word these days, and it probably needs a little bit of definition up front of what does it mean that we're talking about, and even the context as we talk about in data management, what does that mean over there? So let me start off with a little bit of discussion in around there, then we'll start to go through some of our use cases over here and be more than happy to open up for some questions at the end. So before I start jumping into it, just a little bit of perspective on CommVault and kind of where we come from. I'll do a little bit of just level setting on CommVault as a company in the vendor space. We offer a software-based solution. I'll kind of put a little context to it here in a second. But fundamentally, strategically, we're very much focused on data. We look at operations. What are you doing in your businesses today? What's the value you're trying to present back to the internal users or external users, in and around the state inside here? And it's really focused more towards the data. And in that data, can we not only go and do the more, nominal things? Can I protect it and recover it to make sure I can cover myself from a DR condition in the business? To more so, can we do other things with that data? So if we've made an investment and we're going to protect it, we're putting it under management somewhere. We're going to go off and we're going to extend it because we may have some compliance needs inside the organization we work in inside here. How do we start to do that without adding a lot of other pieces to the puzzle, without adding a lot of other additional infrastructure and complexities into the business? Because if we can do that, and what we see in most companies, and this is not only in the government space, commercial space, the vendor space, service provider space, big and small out there, is most people that are generating data today have data for a purpose. Some of it may be short-lived, some of it may be long-lived. If I can provide a solution that gives you the ability to life cycle it through all those generations of the data out there, that's where you start to really come back to it and say, it's not just a piece of things that we're managing, it actually becomes a valuable asset for the business. We're able to come back in and create some value add use cases. So I'll kind of give a couple of examples of that here in a second. So as with any presentation, you probably want to start off here and kind of what's this confusing landscape that we're all kind of coming into. And you've probably heard a couple of these terms presented today, or in all the different vendor or the magazines, everything else you're kind of dealing with out there saying, these are the new changes coming into our organizations on what are the new technologies, what are the new enabling pieces. I think as the kickoff presentation went through today, some of the disruptive technologies out there. To disrupt, they have to figure out how do I actually implement them in my business smartly and actually be able to create value on the back end inside there. This is a lot of what CommVault does. So CommVault comes into this position over here to say we offer a software-based solution set, platform-oriented as we like to put inside there, that can run on independent hardware and infrastructure out in your environments. Could be on gear that you have inside your data center today. Could be on gear running off in the cloud environments, the Amazons or the Microsofts and Azures and others of the world inside there. Could be running in physical, virtual, all different kind of combination sets inside there. And the advantage inside this is by starting to implement that solution, starting to control your data, putting it under management, that's where you're able to start to drive a lot of the value. CommVault is a company, and I'm just going to give a couple highlights to this one over here, and then really kind of get back to the topic at hand, is we define ourselves as we're a recognized industry leader in the space, technology and people first. When I say people first, CommVault's a business that's been very, very much built on an organic basis. We haven't gone out, we haven't acquired all the different pieces of the puzzle over here. We kind of came up with a very strong position actually about 15 years ago on the power of data. We said, let's go implement a system to go off and tackle that. And what we've been doing for the last 15 years is saying, how do we keep improving on that? How do we keep innovating towards those end goals, changing with the environments and changing with the market conditions inside there? More importantly, it's not just about technology, it's about the support. And we really spend a lot of time on support excellence because we know it's not just how our software works, it's how does it work in the context of your business. Your business may be pieces you own in a dedicated manner, or maybe pieces that you're renting as a service from another cloud vendor. How do we start to interrelate inside there? Innovation driven, what we've been doing since day one is sitting down and innovating. And I'll say, most will sit here and say we have a very big group of smart people. And I'll tell you the truth, we have a very big group of people who like to listen first and then say, how do we analyze what we just heard to say, how do we improve on it? And that's a lot of our customer-driven focus. So CommVault as CommVault as a customer-driven company, we spend a lot of the time sitting with companies like yourselves and sitting with organizations like yourselves to understand the scope of your problems, to say, can we come up with a innovative approach to resolve it over here? And more importantly, we get into a lot of strategic discussions inside there of what's going to be happening in your business in the next 18 months. How do we anticipate that? How do we make sure that we can develop capabilities into that picture to be there for you when you're ready to migrate into that next solution going forward? That's what I'm going to share a bit of today, of the interaction we're having with a lot of customers on cloud. What are those use cases looking like? How are they starting to really implement and gain value coming from them? So, cloud. If this was 2 years ago, we'd probably be having a discussion around virtual machines, getting rid of physical servers, stacking them up into virtuals, and all the other context inside there. You know, those waves and those generations, I think, in the most part, every organization we deal with today, I would venture to say the servers under management are now about 80% virtualized. The data, in most cases, is about 15 to 20% virtualized. So there's a lot of workloads being virtualized, but a lot of the big data sets on those applications, all the other conditions, the home directory environments, everything else, don't easily fit into virtualized environments. So this is really kind of the new change happening inside the cloud. And this is, sorry about that. There's a great quote we had from one of our customers. We were doing a briefing with them about 3 weeks ago. And one of the largest private companies inside the US over here, going through a transition. They were a very silo-based traditional IT shop and saying, no, we've got to go back and we've got to recast ourselves into kind of a cloud-first mentality. And inside that is cloud to them, they had this great quote, so I said, let me steal it, is not about where it is, it's about what it does for me. It's about how do I start to have it interact. It can be equipment I have in my data center. It can be services that I'm able to acquire and use on the public cloud environment over here. It can be combinations thereof. So it's really not just the location, it's how do I go in and start to orchestrate and control the different endpoints. In a decision tree too, it's not just about the management on top. We're always after that top end. If I can understand it and manage it, put it into a great dashboard, it makes life simple and easy. But we do have to go and tackle all the other elements of the equation inside there too. How do we implement control? If we have data and I'm a public entity inside here, do I have outside compliance needs? If I have data that's crossing a state border, do I suddenly trip over some encryption needs inside there? Do I have privacy rules? Do I have all those other kind of conditions that come into play there? So this is a lot of the new decision points that come into a cloud decision inside here. Really, it's not that much different from what we've been designing in IT applications for a number of years in the kind of the remote environments. The advantage these days is instead of going off and buying all the equipment, doing all that design work and deployment, in many cases we can start to acquire that on the outside. So if we look at kind of this cloud-first mentality, and I think this is, again, a summary of what we're seeing in a lot of the executives coming back on our customers coming in and sharing their plans and strategies for next year. And what I try to do inside here is say, how do I kind of summarize them into something a little bit more relevant for here? If I look at this one, the things on the left-hand side are what we've all been kind of traditionally dealing with. So when we go off to do new deployments, how do we plan, buy, deploy, architect? How do we have to think on a generational basis? This is going to be an awesome architecture to us for the next 2 or 3 years. Then it's going to have to be turned over all over again inside there. Some of the nice promises of the cloud on the right-hand side are, well, the vendor who's doing the infrastructure on the other side takes that problem off of your plate. I can put things in the cloud. I don't care about how are they going to get migrated from a Gen 2 to a Gen 3 or a G8 to a G9 server as that generation changes inside there. That's part of the cloud provider's problem to deal with for me over here. It's that level of abstraction. The other shift inside here is how do we start to think about ourselves more as a service? So on my left-hand side, I have my favorite word of the month here is bespoke. And I have this because as I was recently doing some customer visits out in Europe, bespoke was described to me about 6 times on that's the program or that's the design they've been developing the last couple of years. I will say, as many in the room probably here are saying, I'm not sure what bespoke means. And I went out and looked it up, and it actually is custom. And it's really a good definition of, in many cases, what people have been doing is customizing a new application build comes off of the team over here. I've got to build an architecture to meet that one over here. And what I end up with at the end is I end up with about 37 different flavors of builds inside my environment over here. And the problem is each one has its own complexities, and there's no way I can really define a service level. So if I look to the right-hand side here and look about things like service levels are about the things like standardizing. And this does not mean you have to go off and completely divorce yourself of your old architectures. In many cases, this is very much a reporting conditions. Do I sit down and do some rationalized thinking with my business teams to say, instead of everybody can have whatever they want, do we try to put ourselves down into 6 or 8 categories? If I can create a standard category there, it's very easy for me to go off and measure it, to build standardization, build some automation against it, and be able to take that one forward. And really, as we keep going up the stack and we go all the way to the top of the infamous thing here of how do we create value back to the business. In prior times, it's been a very opaque thing, or cloudy. You can even accuse it to be that. There's some alignment. We spend a lot of time trying to define and rationalize back and forth. One of the nice things in a cloud or orchestrated kind of environment is because of that reporting. Because if I have some standardization side there, I can measure the differences. If I can go off and create some metrics that have outcome impact to the business and meaning there, it's a lot easier for me to go off and demonstrate value. And that value could be things like if I'm coming in to start to provision new applications and other things to the business, how long does it take me? In my old style, we had a workflow through the help desk and through 4 or 5 different people in the teams, and we had a great website we built for it to help speed it through the process there, but it was still a 5 or 6 day operation to get from point A to point B. In a nice orchestrated environment here, I may actually get it all the way to the point that a user has the ability to come over here, right click, request one up inside here, have the backend go ahead and provision it for them, bring it online, allow me to go off and start to do my operation inside there, and more importantly, get some oversight to it to say, if I stop using that in 30 days, should I go retire it off the system? I don't want to have a lot of things kind of lingering through there. All great ideas that a couple years ago were kind of pipe dreams. As we look at today's environments where a lot of these capabilities now exist, it becomes a matter of how do I start to orchestrate some of these together. So next we look at kind of the final piece of the puzzle over here to get into the discussion of what are the 2 differences we see inside some of these environments from a value proposition. And I think every IT vendor will sit here and concentrate highly on the red side. How do we go off and reduce costs? How do we do things more efficiently? How do you do 4 times what you can do today with the resources you were doing 1 of 3 years ago? That's a very common theme inside there. And I think that's the advent of automation, capacity pricing. I can do more with less and all those other kind of aspects inside there. The challenge to the business is how do I actually also introduce the other side of the equation, the blue side? How do I create value back to the teams? How do I put the data in touch with those people? Back to my example of how do I create that VM very quickly inside there. If I have an application developer that's sitting here and burning hours waiting for something to happen on the other side, that's productive time that I'm not having them do their core job. Me as the CTO sitting up on top here, I have to go back to my boss and tell him, I don't think we're going to make it this month because we couldn't get the next 2 builds done because we spent too much time waiting to get 16 machines developed up on top over there. And that's not a hypothetical. As I'll show you here in a minute, we actually did a couple of these life cases on ourselves, and that's where a lot of this innovation has actually come out on the other side here. So if we take that notion of IT versus business value, and we start to kind of compare it in different use cases out there, you can kind of see on one side, we have the traditional, how do I do converged approaches? I'm in an environment that I have 16 different tools across my different units out there doing backup, recovery, and other kind of applications out there. Behind those 16 different tools, I have 16 people, or God forbid, I have 4 people who have to learn 16 different things. And then I have to go back to them every time and say, is everything working as expected? Can we actually make improvements? And We just realized that the state is doing a new launch on something next year, and we're going to double the amount of things we're doing. And everybody creates havoc inside there. All the way to the other side of saying, if I start to get out to some of those really neat, cool things, like we talked about earlier today, some of that file sharing, some of that things in social media, when the data starts to float out and I have users interacting with it where it's not within the confines of my data center over here, how do I start to actually put some control into there too? Because what's happening in most businesses today is the definition of IT is not just within my data center bounds anymore. It's how do I put control, and some of that data center and assets may be sitting off in somebody else's data center over there. When I look at the relationship inside here, it's really kind of a two-way. It's IT costs coming down. That's where the value becomes more increasingly on the consolidation. IT guys love it. But when I go try to sell that to the business, it's a very hard time to go off and say, how do I create a business case for it? To the other side, to say, if I'm going out and I'm impacting 10,000 users out there today, how does that actually generate to a lot of IT value? IT guys reluctantly do it. They don't like to have 10,000 people looking at their outcome every day. But when you look and you say, I've just enabled mobile people to be able to go off and ensure they have no loss of recoverability. I have compliance covered inside there. I don't have to send around home drives and everything else to have people do it on their own. Or if I'm starting to get into a information requirements kind of a context out there, I want to start to do some collaboration and sharing. Can I go back and start to utilize some of that data inside here? Here's where some of these points start to cross over and the value really kind of gets introduced in a brand new manner over here. So, as I talked about earlier, orchestration is one of these key enablers. And orchestration really starts at the context of all the different problems we're trying to deal with. When I look at different environments here and I'm trying to stitch business processes that are going to span different places inside there, I have to deal with things like, how do I deal with security? How do I deal with reporting? How do I deal with two different systems that are highly automated, but if I go talk to an Azure cloud and I talk to an Amazon, or I talk to a Hyper-V cloud over here internally, or I talk to a VMware, or any of the other flavors inside there, each one has some different dynamics. Either I have to become the expert to go in and integrate each one of those individually, and you have to go off and hire yourself a bunch of internal developers, or you come back and you say, do I have a customer or a partner that can kind of help me span this? And that's a lot of what we've been doing inside here. So let me give a couple of quick examples here. So if we start off in the private cloud, and private clouds is my terminology for this is your new virtualization environment out here. So we went over, we took away all of our physicals, we went virtualized, we have C blocks and V blocks and D blocks and everything else inside there now inside the business. There being new VM workloads are being created almost automatically every night. I no longer have a help desk ticket system, it just automatically pops up inside there. Now, if your responsibility is saying, how do I handle the protection and recovery of that environment, and somebody forgot to tell me about a change that happened inside there, that's where it can be a little bit of a hard outcome. That's why we've built a lot of things like how do you do policy-based auto discovery over here. So as new things occur, your system automatically corrects to it, grabs it, and goes off and protects it automatically. All neat, cool, wonderful things. The problem you get into is the notion of sprawl. So we have a lot of customers that they started in their environment, I'm going to say 2 years ago with 500 VMs initially inside the build there. We go back about a year or two later and they're already up to about 2,000 VMs inside there. And we ask, is every one of those really hypercritical? They're like, I don't know, but I just have to keep feeding it more and more resources on the back end. So we stopped back from that and we said, okay, how about if we give you some management and control points? So while you're doing protection over here, what about if we add some extensions to that to come over here and say, when we go off to protect all those different images, we can check on the status of the image. Is somebody really using it? No, nobody's really been using this image here for the last 10 days. It's kind of like the light switch. I know in California it's mandatory everywhere. When nobody's in the room and there's nobody in there, they all pop off. It's the same notion coming into play over here. If I can come into your environment and say, if I see there's a bunch of parts inside there that haven't been utilized, let me turn them off, power them down inside here. So critically, you get those resources back for reuse. That's a great, cool thing to start off with. Next piece of that is, well, this keeps going on. And I come back around in another 10 or 15 days, and while I powered it off and nobody powered it back on, now it's my decision point to say, should I start to go and move that around? And moving it around is because I have a lot of my VMs now and some very expensive hardware. I went out and spent a fair amount of money with my friends over at EMC or NetApp or whoever it may be out inside there. If I'm not really utilizing all those VMs in there, should I shift them around? It's kind of a file archiving, email archiving notion. The difference is in VMs, we see on average most virtual machines out there are probably about 80 gigs in size. So archiving my mailbox and getting a couple of 1 or 2 meg PowerPoints out of the way is a nice thing, but if I'm able to go off and take out 80 or 200 gigs worth of data that's not needed on the high-end production system, move it over, it's still available to my users, but I'm able to automatically shift it around inside there. The nice thing about this is not dependent on matched hardware. So I'm not talking about a EMC to EMC, it's really kind of an any to any kind of a context, because we're doing it up at the software layers. Final piece is when I start to come through there, and I do that, and then I get to the final stage, and I've done all this work, and I've moved it around, and still nobody came back looking for it, is that the time that I can go in and archive it out altogether? And in many cases, people say, well, archiving is pretty easy. I just go in and delete it. I think I have a tape copy of it somewhere, so if I ever need to get to it, I can. The difference here is you're doing that under a retention policy. And more importantly, you don't have to do it. All you have to do is tell the system, this is when I want the policy to occur. So if this is gone for 30 days and nobody's using it, go ahead and retire it out of the system. Why this is critical is we see in a lot of virtualized environments today, there's a fair number of them being used in test dev environments. And I'll tell you, developers are not sensible in turning things off after they're done with them. They like to leave things around. We've seen customers out there that have been able to reduce their inventories by 30 or 40% on the left-hand side here by starting to better manage those virtual machines out there to say what should be turned off, moved around, or archived off all the way to the side over here. So moving away from kind of the private cloud up to the public cloud. So public cloud these days, and I would say probably the 2 most dominant factors, especially on the West Coast over here, would be our friends over at Amazon and our friends over at Azure. And we see Azure in almost every case today. If you have Windows laptops sitting around your organization, when you sign that new EA agreement, I will almost guarantee you, if you go in and check the details inside there, you got a big block of Azure resource to go off and utilize in the next year or 2. And what we're seeing is a lot of those customers come back and say, well, Microsoft just gave me this great advantage, but I can't figure out how do I go off and use it. And in many cases, they'll come back to say, well, what about if I can get this into a DR use case? And when I look at traditionally, how does DR work in most businesses? So I've got my on-premise site here on the bottom, and I'm doing my backup copies over here. I dump them out to tapes, send them on a truck to Iron Mountain or wherever inside here. Sometimes I may send them up to a dedicated replication copy up inside here. And then on probably my top 10 workloads, the ones that when they go down, my boss calls me and says, you know, you better get in. Those are the ones I'm usually replicating up to the top over here. So I get into these very special condition sets, and if you start to go off and do DR testing, which being from the East Coast and out of the Sandy Zone, DR testing is no longer just a good idea. It's now actually a quarterly process in a lot of our customers on the East Coast. They say this is a lot of lost weekends. They can move all the data to the facility, then I have to go over to SunGard and say, okay, now I have to go start lighting things up, copying things in. How do I get the whole thing done? How do I show a report back so I can get to the kids' soccer game, you know, late afternoon over here? Fingers crossed. The alternative is if I start to go off and start to use some of these public resources. So instead of going over and having an expensive contract on the other side over here, the great thing about public cloud is I pay for it by the use. I don't need to go over and give them a lot of money for the right to say, I want to go in and turn on 10 machines tomorrow. All I need to do is have an account with them and say, let me go off. These are the 10 kind of machines I need. Let's go turn them on. So the first thing in cloud is cloud can have active machines running there. So if I want to have a recovery use case over there and a replication, it's there without a problem. That's simple and easy. What most are starting to do too is to say, do I take that data set and get rid of tape? Do I take that data set, and if I can do smart things like dedupe and encryption, can I go off and stage that up into the cloud resource? Sure, I'll pay a little bit of money for it, but now I have a complete set of my data in some other facility over there, so I really got all of my eggs covered. The problem on this other picture over here is I may have 10% of my machines covered, but then in a real DR condition over here, I have to figure out what do I do with the other 90% of the environment. Once I have the data up inside the cloud, and this is where we offer a lot of things like native copy straight up into an Amazon or Azure and about 22 other cloud vendors out there. This is where I can start to come in and use a lot of the provisioning capabilities. So if I can go into here, and I kind of state it up on the corner over here, I can do a recovery straight from my desk. I can come in there and say, if I had virtual machines I protected, I want 5 of these and go recover these direct up into Azure. We'll copy the data inside the cloud over here, automatically convert it over and turn it on to an Azure machine up and running inside there. If it's other data sets inside there, same thing. We can create the machine for you, go ahead and pour your data back in, file, application data, whatever it may be inside there. So the nice thing is this is where that orchestration layer comes in back and forth. Most importantly, from the IT guys, that's awesome, really cool, easy. Do it from my desk over here. So that means I can actually do it Friday afternoon, get to the kids' soccer game on Saturday morning. To the business person inside there is saying, well, that's all nice. It kind of sounds like I can do over here. The main difference is when I'm done with my DR test, I come over here, I take it all back down. I'm not paying cost for all those resources for the next quarter because I'm actually not even using any of them. Next quarter I want to go in, I want to do another 10% of the organization. I pick the next 10%, turn them on, run them for 3 or 4 days, get my test finished, take them down, and I'm able to cycle them through there. We've seen this probably become one of the most popular attached cases, as I said, back to that whole EA agreement. So where a lot of customers are coming back in and saying, I suddenly got a quantity of Azure to use, but I don't know how to use it. This is the nice thing, especially in CommVault customers. Today, all they need to do is have an Azure account, configure, push the data up into there, and then configure the other options up on top of there. No more equipment, no more special devices, no more gateways needed in the middle. So back to that whole orchestration, how do I start to use that more elegantly beyond just kind of a nice DR, kind of, I save the business once a quarter on kind of a testing cycle inside there. And this is really back to the use case we talked about earlier. If you have customers, and it could be internal stakeholders that are doing application development work out there, and what they're trying to do is say, they need to come in and they need to be able to create different things across different clouds inside the environment there. The problem is they're going to be coming on the state's contract over here. You get the credit card bill and you have to figure out how do I make sure that they don't misuse it. Do they pick the low images that are $1,000 a month, not the one that's $10,000 a month? IT guys will always go for the shiny, spinny things inside there if they're not controlled. So what we developed inside here was an internal policy system to say, let's put some orchestration to this. IT can create a set of policies to go against different cloud vendors. This can be private, hybrid, public, whatever it wants to be inside there. I can align it to different service levels inside the business. So I can say I have a development group that's allowed to come in and do things in Amazon over here and only pick certain workloads out there to ensure that I can control the cost. Better yet, the the users can come in and they can automatically do it 24/7. So you create the policy, they use the policy to go off there and do self-service. They right-click, and it even comes down to a web page or even comes down to your Windows over here. There's a nice little plug-in there that they can right-click, create it right from their machine, go in and use it, and if you set a 30-day policy on it, at the end of 30 days, they're going to get a reminder, do you want to extend it? If not, we'll automatically go and clean it out for you. So this is, I may use this in a DR test to say, after DR has been done, 3 days, let me go ahead and retire the system and clean it up. Or do I start to use this more aggressively in my business to say, I bought myself a cloud infrastructure, and I'm trying to figure out how do I enable the users next. This is a nice intersection point inside there. How do I help automate those pieces? And the nice thing about it is it's not just automation, but you also have the control point in the back end. What's the kind of metrics you need to go back and say, am I doing an effective job? As I talked about earlier, that whole notion of outcomes. In this case over here, here's my lead development manager over here saying, is he getting his payback? his $250 an hour that he has on wasted time, how many hours were we able to eliminate inside there? How many VMs are we created? How many are we retiring on a regular basis to keep it highly efficient and moving inside the environment over there? Okay, getting to the last two use cases over here. And this is probably the one that we see much more in the start of the compliance orientation. So the great thing about cloud, and I'll tell you, we spend probably more time in talking economics than technology with customers around cloud strategies. It's this notion of, it's the penny a gig or a month. That sounds wonderful. Let me just keep throwing more things against it. And what happens quickly over time is I start to put it into there, and I can encrypt and dedupe and put everything into there. And I get back to kind of my picture down here. If anybody's a fan of the, what was it? It's the final scene in the Harrison Ford movies. Raiders of the Lost Ark, thank you. This is kind of that notion that we see in a lot of cases of, let me just keep putting more stuff into boxes, let me go stick it off in some warehouse. I've got my compliance done, but somewhere there, somebody's paying a fair amount of money for all those boxes going to that warehouse over there. And what we've seen, even with cloud today, and that new, cool, great pricing you see dropping every time, when you keep accumulating, and I'm not really deleting anything inside there, it keeps growing and growing and growing. And we've seen a number of customers that got to the point inside there to say, when they started one of these tasks over here, and this is not just a 10 or 50 terabyte kind of a problem, we've had a number that he was getting to a 7-year strategy. By month 7, he had already accumulated about 450 terabytes of usage in a cloud inside, and it was compress and dedupe as much as we could inside there. The problem was he spent all the money he had in month 7 in comparison to what he was spending all of the prior year. And month 8 was going to add some more incremental on top of there, and they were going to proceed through all the way inside the remaining 4 months of the year. So the point being in here is economics. How do I do a budget analysis inside there? How do I understand the real dynamics of how this is building up? And what this really kind of came down to in many cases here, it's a decision point of not, how do I try to get up to the cloud more cheaply? It really becomes a decision point to say, am I really putting just the right relevant data in the cloud? So we sat down, and probably a good final point to note into that customer use case over there. One other thing to note in all the cloud vendors out there, and many don't see this until they kind of scroll all the way down to the bottom there, is what's your what I call the cloud breakup fee. It's free to bring it in. You can put it up there, and it's cheap to keep inside there. If you go and you attempt to take a lot of it down, if you're taking 5 pictures down of the family vacation from last year, no problem. If you're a business and you're doing something like an e-discovery pull, I need to go back and I need to do a Freedom of Information Act pull out of the cloud of all that data from last year. If I have to take a lot of data coming out of there, then I start to pay a fair price inside there. And I'll tell you, in most customers we deal with that have dealt with storage for years, I never bought a NAS filer that had a read charge on the back of it. So this whole notion is something brand new to the environment. Many of the models didn't account for it. And we had one customer who made a couple of bad mistakes with Amazon, and it cost them about $42,000 in copy back read fees inside there. And even though with our great relationship with Amazon, I think it was 60 originally, so we got them to knock it down on a, gee whiz, I'm a rookie status over here, down to about 42, but they're unforgiving from that point. They'll give you a little bit of trial to get on here, but once you're inside that pricing model, you have to be very smart on how do you start to utilize your data inside there. So back to the equation over here on this whole cloud notion. So what many of us have done is we implemented our old Iron Mountain strategy, and we said instead of us taking backup copies, exporting them out, putting them on that truck and sending them out to that Iron Mountain facility under the ground somewhere, can I just take Iron Mountain out of the equation and just start shipping that to cloud? And that's where this accumulation problem starts to occur. Because in Iron Mountain, when I'm just paying, I bought the tape, I'm just renting it on a space over here, I'm probably not going to use it, doesn't really come anywhere close to charging me the kind of annual fees I have inside the cloud storage over here. So with many of these customers, we sat down and said, is the real root of the problem is, instead of you putting all the data up to there, should you go and just pick out the data that's relevant? They said, absolutely yes. But here's the problem. They're like, well, I can't go and implement backup of everything here because I need to recover the business, and then have a whole secondary thing of saying, how do I go off and then do other picks from the top of just this relevant data out inside there? That's too expensive, and I can't get back to production. I can only touch production once. So we sat down and said, well, what about if we build kind of a better method? We'll take all those backup copies here, so you can do that fast recovery back over here. But instead of just shipping it wholesale up to the cloud, what about if we give you a capability in the back to go in there and pick out just the relevant pieces? And we built a policy engine on there that says, okay, let's sit down with the business team here and say, what's the relevant data we need for retention rules? Is it based on people? Is it based on projects? Is it based on certain terminology inside the business? Is it based on certain file types out there? So these are kind of the dimensions you sit down with the business team to say, what do we really need to do to comply with that 5, 7, or 10-year retention policy on the back end here? When they do that, and I'll say we've done that with a number of customers that were doing this on a very large scale, we've seen them drop Iron Mountain bills by a tremendous amount of money by coming in here, and when this is usually done smartly, you come in here and you usually kind of net out with probably about 30% of the data from the left-hand side is really the only data that needs to go into the cloud for long-term retention. But it really kind of comes down to having that business decision. How do I sit down and have that workshop with the team over here to say what's smart, what needs to go up there? Certain industries, pharmaceutical, it's a lot bigger. In other cases, we've seen it can be a lot smaller inside there too. Now, once my data is up in the cloud, this is really where back to my value proposition, where that whole blue side of the equation starts to turn on. By having data up in the cloud, I have one distinct advantage. The cloud is accessible everywhere. If I have data sitting on a server in my environment, behind my firewall security rules and everything else inside there, and I have to have a user get on the VPN and dial up and put in two-factor authentication to kind of get into my corporate networks, that's why users usually don't do it. It's too much friction. That's why they all start to say, I take all of my work product and I put it out in Dropbox. And then you're like, oh my God, you can't have state contracts sitting out on Dropbox in the open here. It's all kinds of security violations. If I can put it up inside here and say I've got a control process, I've got it encrypted, I have the access built in, but more importantly, I can have direct access into that cloud. This is where I can start to see things like, how do I take my users and I give them direct access to that data set inside there? That can be from laptops, from Windows clients, from applications, even directly off of my little iPhone over here. Dial up, find the files that I'm looking for over there, go off and share them with somebody else on the outside over here, but in a secure manner that's audited and part of your security policy and process on the inside over here. And most importantly, the reason why we see most people doing compliance is not just for the good of data. It's not really a secret strategy by the storage vendors. What it usually is you have regulation sitting behind it. And it's highly likely that some of that data is going to have to be acquired again to bring back in and put under some search and compliance. If any of you have dealt with companies like Kroll OnTrack, we have to go put a whole box of things, ship it up to Minnesota. They decompile it, they kind of put it all into a readable form. They send it back to me. I have to pay a nice fat $20,000 to get my data back in a readable form over here to go over and hand over to my lawyers. It's about a 2-week process. If you have your data up in here and it's what we call compliance ready, meaning it's there, it's all indexed, it's secured. If you want to go turn on your discovery options, they're available right inside there. In fact, you don't even have to take it back down to your site. That's the nice thing about using cloud, which, like we demonstrated before, cloud lets me go off and turn on servers at will. I can go off and put on 2 content indexing servers in the cloud, index that data set from the questionable period of last year, go off and hand it off to my lawyers over here, I'm done with the operation. When they come back in and say, Brian, that's awesome, we finished off today, I can go back and retire the whole thing so I'm not spending any more money inside there. This is where this whole cloud notion, especially when you start to get into information management, security risk, and all that other side of the equation, becomes a very, very big implementer or a very big advantage into your equation over here. So closing off, couple of key learnings. Kind of gave a couple examples as we went through here. As you're starting to approach a cloud strategy, there's lots of dimensions to it. And what I would highly suspect or highly suggest is sitting down and, even if it comes down to a whiteboard, draw what are we trying to get done? How are we trying to clarify what we're trying to accomplish inside here? Is this really just a notion of going after things like IT cost reduction? That's a little bit more simplified. If I'm going after the business aspects of coming in to do things like the search, I want end users and other things into it, that starts to really define your scope. What you want to also look for is, how do I get native cloud access? Back to one of those examples I shared earlier, somebody who had 400 terabytes in a cloud vendor over there chose poorly. The cloud vendor was not a highly financed public entity. They were a private one out in California over here. They were, one of those ones they were talking about on stage earlier. Fast, innovative riser over here on the monetization fast track, and unfortunately, they ran out of cash. 400 terabytes in the cloud, where you can get about a terabyte a day out of the cloud, presents a problem on how long do you have to go off and collect all of your data when the cloud vendor comes back to say, you have 2 weeks before I shut it down, and I'm selling all the pieces on eBay. In this case over here, because we had the advantage of native access, we put the data into there. We were able to go off to our friends over at Microsoft, work with them. They were able to open up, pull all the data in about 3 days from that private cloud to the Microsoft cloud over here. Because we use the same format on both sides, we're able to go off and read it and everything else back in a no impact back to the customer. This is probably one of the most important things that most people are not thinking about in cloud today is, how do I deal with that migration? It's going to occur. You're going to get to a point of wherever I put something with a 5 or 10 year life cycle, the notion of cloud is I don't have to worry about copying it over 4 times, but you may come back to say, well, my budget ran out and I need to go off and move it to something else. How do I have an exit strategy inside there? It's something a lot of people miss. 3 years on your business case. Back to that example we talked about earlier. Don't think about just the 7 months. Put it on the 3 years, understand what's the budget really going to grow into on a comparison basis. It still makes a lot of sense, but you got to make sure you're budgeting your spend appropriately inside there too. On the bandwidth, and this is probably one of the harder things that most people are dealing with, is once you go outside of the boundaries of your organization, bandwidth becomes a very big component. Many cases, people are doing bandwidth on small workloads. Our example in DR before. The top 10 ones are what we replicated back and forth. If I'm now going to move a majority of my data into cloud to take full advantage of the DR and everything else, that's bandwidth considerations I have to put in place there. Either I have to be wholesale or I have to be selective. Back to our use case of saying maybe it's not everything. Maybe I only want to do the critical things for the business over here. And then finally, be prepared to test. I'd love to say there is an awesome set of benchmarks out there, and every cloud vendor has the specs up on top that you can go off and read, plug into your spreadsheets, and they're all going to live up to that example inside there. We find it's not the case. There's different offers inside there. Every one of the new cloud vendors has a different new express path, giggy, 10 giggy, and all other kind of connection points into there. You have latency issues that can start to crop up even in your own telecom network hops of how do you get to the internet, how do you get over into those equations over there. Testing is not hard. Again, as we mentioned before in kind of the DR case, something you can do from the back end over here. You don't have to go on site for it, but it is hypercritical to really understand the dynamics of the infrastructure and the kind of use case you're looking to implement inside there. So with that, kind of putting a little bit of closure to it, so back to kind of a little bit of the CommVault pitch over here. We do have a booth over in the exhibit hall. Happy to kind of walk you through some of those more examples in a little bit more detail. We also do have a very deep portfolio of cloud partners. We were an early adopter into the cloud storage space. I checked slides last night. Actually, we started that project back in 2009. So we were actually one of the first ones to be able to write to Azure and Microsoft Cloud even before they had a name for it inside there. We've moved that through all the other cloud vendors inside market. We've got a lot of service partners too that can also assist in that interaction inside there. How do you want to do those designs? How do you want to start to intermix inside here? So there's a lot of experience we have in depth inside there. Final piece, I'll kind of leave anybody who's interested in a little bit more of the detail on CommVault and everything else. Come back to the booth over here. We'll be happy to kind of explore a little bit more and kind of give a little bit more color and background of the company. But with that, I know we're kind of tight on time here, but happy to open it up for any questions. Good, it means either I exhausted everybody or everybody's extremely hungry and waiting for lunch over here and they don't want to delay any further. Well, thank you for your time and attention.